everyone, and welcome to LogTech Live with Eric Johnson. I am not Eric Johnson, but he is on a much-needed vacation right now, and he's left me in charge. I'm not entirely sure that was a good decision, but I guess we will see at the end of this show. So, my name is Sarah Barnes-Humphrey. I am the founder and host of Let's Talk Supply Chain, the Blended podcast, and the founder of the Blended Pledge. And this is LogTech Live Takeover. And because I am taking this over, we are doing things a little bit differently today. And so James, my guest for today, has already joined me up on stage. I know Eric kind of talks for like 20 minutes about what's happening in the industry. You guys don't want to hear me talk for 20 minutes. So I think we want to bring James up a little bit early and start the conversation. So James, welcome to LogTech Live. How are you today?
Hey, Sarah, I'm very good. Thank you for having me. And well, I guess thank you to Eric and yourself for having me on the show.
Yeah, and you're coming to us live from London, right? What's London looking like today on a Friday morning?
Indeed. I think we've got West Coast weather. So it was freezing cold this morning and now it's sunny. So yeah, we're enjoying that kind of winter summer extravaganza.
I mean, you really have to enjoy the summer once, or the sun once it comes out. I mean, my whole family is in the UK, and I know that like once the sun comes out, you got to run out there, try to get a little bit of a tan, and then it kind of goes away.
Yeah, it's a contrast that does it, right? I think if it's sunny all year, then you don't get to appreciate the highs of 30 days of sun that we get in the UK. Yeah.
All right. So for anybody who's joining us, make sure that you let us know where you're tuning in from. Put it in the comments. If you have any questions throughout the show, this is a great time to do it. So James, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell everybody who you are and what you do.
Cool. I'm James Coombes. I am the CEO of a company called Raft. I think we have it as Raft.ai here on the blurb. What we do is we are an intelligent logistics platform for freight forwarders and customs brokers. And I can go into more detail about what that means later.
Yeah, we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into that and talk a little bit about what freight forwarders are needing. What are they looking for? How is the technology helping? All sorts of things. So stay tuned for that. But first, let's talk a little bit about a market update. You're sitting in London. You're sort of in the European vibes. I'm sitting in Canada and the North American vibes. But from a market update standpoint, what are people talking about in logistics technology in supply chain right now? What are kind of the buzz terms and what are customers talking to you about?
Yeah, thanks for putting that one on me as well, Sarah. Really appreciate you.
We'll talk about it. You started. I'll throw some stuff in.
All good. So look, I think I guess two clear stories. One is clearly where freight rates are. We're clearly in a super cycle where freight rates are lower and are likely to continue to go lower. I think Zanetta had a big piece out recently about freight rates being or having dropped significantly. But I don't think that's really a surprise to anyone, right? So I think like a continuation of that story. And then the other big piece that kind of I've seen kind of on my radar is kind of just discussions around visibility. How I think this was actually catalyzed partly by Eric's piece that he kind of dropped that hand grenade and then went on holiday around visibility and the kind of like how much use kind of visibility and kind of what kind of use shippers are getting from visibility and whether it's worth it. So that's definitely been doing the rounds. So they're kind of the highlights for me this week.
Yeah. And, visibility is a hot topic. It means different things to different people. I'm glad that you brought it up. And literally yesterday, I just recorded an episode of the podcast with Richard White from WiseTech, which I can't wait for it to come out. And one of the questions I asked him was, how do you see visibility? How do you talk about visibility? And the answer that he had to that question, I'm not going to, give you a sneak peek on that one, but it's very intriguing intriguing what he was talking about, how he was talking about visibility, and how visibility actually turns into action. So I'm not going to give away the farm on that one, but you definitely want to stay tuned for that particular answer in that particular episode. We're going to be talking a little bit more about AI as well in the conversation as we talk about your technology and how you help and the impact that it's making in the industry. But do you have any like what's the conversation happening in Europe around AI? I know here in the US, people are getting a little bit scared. They've signed some petitions. They're like, this is not going to be good. So is that the same kind of scenario in Europe? Is that how people are thinking about it, or?
Well, I think look, Europe is clearly, I wouldn't say, is kind of the front of the curve in terms of this, right? I mean, I think AI has definitely been pushed by some of the kind of large kind of US players, right? OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, and so on. I think in Europe, why we do have that presence, clearly a lot more of a focus has been on kind of the safety and the ethics and the regulation of AI, and I think that will continue. I think clearly we're in this kind of hype phase, right, where everyone's kind of realizing what the possibilities are. I think there's a lot more room in this going forward. Like as a company, clearly we are an AI company. We've been thinking about this since like 2017, right? So we've been planning to deliver AI to enterprises and large companies for almost 6 years. So it's something that we think about a lot. But in terms of Europe, yeah, like I think clearly beyond things like regulation, there's an amazing opportunity. There's a lot of enterprises. I think Europe has a big kind of enterprise and B2B focus. And I think we'll start to see that kind of bubbling up. And I think there'll be some amazing companies kind of really deploying AI to really big problems at big companies.
Cool. Well, I like that. All right. Well, before we get into the overview of Raft in particular, I found this article that I thought we could potentially talk about because it talks about technology that are helping to make supply chains more sustainable. So I thought this was along the lines of LogTech, right? It's technology driven. And it's an interesting article. It kind of focuses more on the food supply chain, which is very interesting. But the three core data-driven technologies that they're talking about in this particular article are sensor tech, blockchain, and predictive analytics. Now, let's start with sensor tech. What they're talking about in this particular article is how they are using sensor technology to prevent food spoilage. What is your take on sensor technology? Do you know much about that? And is it one of those technologies that can really help us to, make supply chains more sustainable?
I mean, I know a little bit about it. I don't know, like, I don't know a huge amount, but I think there's probably a world where every container or the contents of every container can be tracked in some shape or form, right? And I think a lot of the problem is about how you measure it and like how do you actually kind of record kind of what's going where? How do you manage to get manufacturers to also implement it? I think there's very much a lot of practicalities that are complicated in how you actually deliver this. So I think you probably would see it in high value goods like the pharma industry, I think clearly is in need of it. And I think food wastage would be a big element of it as well. I think Maersk put out something a few years ago about how much wastage there is in this industry. And so it's clearly a topic that deserves attention and something that I think is important. The way we think about it is that I think visibility is a big, I won't front run other things that we talk about on visibility, but I think one of the things are that you should be able to access that kind of visibility wherever it is, right? Whether it's from kind of normal kind of tracking and AIS and all the other kind of visibility stuff, or whether it's this kind of really detailed, granular kind of RFID type of visibility. I think whatever it is, I think there's a place for it to be in the basically to be seen in a platform at either a freight forwarding at a shipper level. And I think there's a ton of things to do there. But I feel like I'm just talking a lot now about something I don't know that much about. So let's move on to the
No, I love it. And we're going to share this article in the comments, Nicole, if you could do that for me. The second one they talk about is blockchain. Now, we've got some big believers. We've got some people who don't necessarily Believe in blockchain. So it's been a bit of a discussion point that I've seen on panel discussions as of late. They're talking about the use of blockchain in identifying safety issues in particular. What is your take? I mean, being in log tech, being in technology and supply chain, what's your take on blockchain?
Yeah, I mean, I don't ever want to be kind of the naysayer for any kind of technology, right? At an intellectual level, I love what blockchain represents and what it does. What I struggle with on the blockchain side is that often there's the Oracle problem. The Oracle problem is how do you trust what even gets on the blockchain? It doesn't matter if it's a secure piece of tech to kind of essentially regulate what's going onto that database and make it secure. But if you can't trust who's putting it on that database in the first place, I think it loses its function. And so I think personally, again, this is a personal opinion, I think the Oracle problem is one that hasn't necessarily been solved. And then I think there's a lot of things that you can achieve with a regular database that blockchain today can be a bit of an overkill for. But that said, it is something that I think in the future definitely could have potential. But I think, I think there's more basic problems to solve first in my mind in supply chain.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mark actually put up a comment about sensor tech can do a number of things, including identifying products within 6 inches of location in warehouses. So, we lose a lot of things in warehouses. So it really helps us find them as well. So I appreciate that, Mark.
I mean, they're often, absolutely. That kind of like a black box sometimes, I think, in terms of like you can track things up to the warehouse and then out of the warehouse, but that shoulder event of things getting into the warehouse and out, I think, is sometimes difficult to track.
Well, no, it's just
anything that makes that better, I think, would be a major big deal.
Well, it takes me back to my air freight days where, you're dealing with the airline, they've lost your cargo, you have no idea where it is in the warehouse. It takes 5 days and they still haven't found it because we're not sure exactly where it is. So I can see those, 5 days or loss of cargo actually go down, obviously, because we can actually find it now in the warehouse. I mean, and that wasn't that long ago. That was only 5 years ago. So the last thing that they mentioned in this particular article was predictive analytics, and they talk about using that to avoid overproduction. Thoughts on predictive analytics before we start talking about Raft?
Like I think it's always predictive analytics is only as good as the data you have. And I think that's often the problem with it is that the data is rarely good enough to get to that point where you can have that kind of impact, especially up and down supply chain, up and down different stakeholders. And I think sometimes that can cause issues. But clearly, I think the end goal is to have predictive analytics across the industry. I think in terms of our customer base, kind of some ability to forecast the kind of supply and demand would clearly be important. I think you can extrapolate that to every single stakeholder. So look, I can't argue against predictive analytics. I think just the issue is that often the data is not there and it's not good enough to be able to really make something of it. So again, I think like blockchain, I think there's a lot of really basic stuff that needs to be fixed before you can get into the kind of the shiny stuff, which is the outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mark makes another good point because I should know this. I use the Apple tags for my luggage. So yes, sensor tech can work not only in supply chain, but also for everybody in their day-to-day lives as well. All right. So now why don't you give us an overview of Raft? What is it that you do? How do you help your customers? What's the impact that you're making on the industry?
Cool. Yeah. So as I said before,
no pressure.
No, all good. This is one of a few areas where I guess I do have a qualified opinion, right? Is that we are an intelligent logistics platform. What that means in principle is that our goal is to automate kind of a large part, if not all, of what we call the kind of shipment life cycle. And that goes from kind of rates on one end and kind of bookings and booking confirmations, etc., all the way through to customs, export customs declarations, import customs declarations, and right through to kind of post-settlement stuff, so payables, kind of invoice reconciliation, payments on the back of invoices, and so on. And so that's what we would put in the bucket of kind of internal operations that our goal is to automate a large part of what our freight forwarding customers and customs brokers customers do. And then the other bucket is a kind of customer-facing piece, and that's somewhere that we're getting into increasingly. And it's really like, how do freight forwarders serve their end customers, right? How do they provide a service to their shipper customers? And we're in a really privileged position where, because we're involved in a lot of different stages of that shipment lifecycle, and we have a lot of data that happens to be standardized, we can translate that and move that into a kind of a digital front end that can then be provided to an end customer. And we're kind of tackling a lot of things that until now have kind of been in the ether, right? It's been like in human heads and emails and all these different pieces. And it takes a lot of work to kind of reconcile that, make that in a standard format, and then deliver it to an end shipper. And so what we do is, on the customer-facing side, is kind of automate a lot of that, so that we can then allow freight forwarders to offer a better service to their end customer. And that's really what it's about, right? I think when we think about serving our freight forwarding customers, we have to think about how we serve the end customer, their shipper, and what they want out of that equation. And that's how we approach our business.
I've been talking a lot about thinking about the customer's customer. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because obviously it's something that's top of mind for a lot of supply chain professionals, and it needs to be top of mind for vendors like yourself, providing that service and that technology to the industry. Now, just quickly, before we go into any of the other questions, what's your founder story? Like, what's your background, and how come you decided to build Raft?
Yeah, I'll give you the short version, because otherwise we'll be here for a while. But like, first job was actually at a shipping line in Birmingham, like the original Birmingham in the UK. So I was I was a guy who I was literally 18. I started off in like reception, but then kind of graduated to. I'd literally just played Minesweeper like all day. So I did that, and then graduated to being the guy who put in all the data. So I would go through all the BLs and everything, and I'd be the one kind of inputting the data into their core system. I can't remember which system it was, but like I was. Like I memorized kind of how many tabs it took to get from place to place. I was recording macros to kind of figure out how to do like common data entry stuff. So like I did that for a fair amount of time. But then I went to university. I did biochemistry. Realized I didn't really want to do that. Ended up at a bank. Moved to the US. Worked on a trading floor, but then worked in commodities. So I did a lot of trade and trade finance as a result. Cool. So worked with a lot of kind of trade houses on stuff like that. I started a furniture company. So I imported furniture into the US from all over the place. Went traveling I went to China, went to the big trade fairs, went to Guangzhou, negotiated all sorts of kind of weird and wonderful deals. And kind of imported furniture into the US West and East Coast. And then, long story short, kind of left all that. We did a master's in the US, focused a lot on international trade and politics, and then got back to the UK and started a company that kind of tackled the pain point that I knew really well, which was the letter of credit, trade finance pain point. And kind of started there, and then kind of started working with a couple of large banks. But then realized that the problems we were tackling there, right, which was understanding data and technology and kind of documents that are involved in the presentation, were equally applicable kind of around the entire supply chain. And I knew freight forwarding pretty well from then, or from my prior experiences, and so kind of went from there. And then essentially worked uniquely with freight forwarders, and ever since we've been working uniquely with freight forwarders, and we now have almost 60 kind of freight forwarders that we work with globally.
Very cool. Thank you for sharing that. You and I have similarities in our backgrounds. I started off as reception. You started off as reception. I wish I would have known you when I was thinking about doing this, but I almost started a furniture package company in Costa Rica. Random, I know, but I ended up going to Costa Rica, looking at furniture, really understanding what was happening over there as they were building homes and different things like that. So, but I had no idea what I was doing, and so it would have been great to have known you back then.
Yeah, it would have been like the blind leading the blind. I'm sure. Like probably transporting furniture around the world is a very difficult kind of thing to do.
Big and bulky,
big and bulky, and all of the stuff. I think the first stuff we brought in ended up like completely smashed when it actually got there.
No.
So it was
Oh, that's not good.
it was
Not good. Not good. All right. So let's continue the conversation around freight forwarding, around logistics tech. So, what do actually, let's talk about capital investment first before we dive in a little bit more into what freight forwarders are looking for. What does capital investment look like currently, do you think, in logistics startups? What is the environment as it stands right now? I mean, I've been reading a lot about how there was a ton of investment over the last couple of years, and now we're starting to see, some of that. I don't think it's dry up, but like we're asking more questions, we're being a little bit more diligent before we're expending that capital. So talk to us about what that looks like right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely asking the right kind of questions, which I think is kind of what is always needed. I think VC in supply chain specifically is maybe going a little bit, or maybe VC generally is going back to basics, I think. And I think what that means, and I think it's what VC was always for, right, is about creating kind of sponsoring, I don't know if that's the right word, but essentially enabling kind of technology companies to really build out their platforms and scale.
Right.
And VC exists as an industry because technology is scalable, right? It's infinitely scalable technically. And so, but what that means is you have to be a genuine software company.
Right.
And so I think a lot of the VC attention now is clearly on kind of more of a focus towards clearly good things like profitability, but equally kind of scalability on the basis of technology with the margins that are associated with technology. And so I think that's where investors are focusing. They're focusing on companies that can scale in that way with the right kind of software margins that historically is where VCs have invested. And so I think there's a bit of a recalibration now to companies that are maybe, especially, I mean, not especially, but in supply chain, have a data and a software focus as opposed to maybe some of the kind of slightly more service-driven companies that have historically been funded, especially over the last kind of 2 or 3 years.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing that, because that's exactly some of the conversations that I've been having. And that now I want to kind of ask you about, Europe and the United States, right? So how do European vendors see the market differently to US software vendors right now? And maybe that ties into capital. I'm not sure. Are we seeing more capital flowing into European vendors versus, North American vendors? Talk to us about what those markets look like and how they are different.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a few different answers to this, right? I think there's just generally I think it's a slightly different approach, right? I think capital is different slightly between European and US types of companies. I think there's, to give you an example, because I guess I can only really talk about us as a company is in terms of our experience, but like we are definitely underweight in terms of like our marketing and how we talk about kind of what we do. And there's probably a little less funding around for European companies as well. So I think the things that we touched on earlier in terms of kind of the funding environment was maybe a little less, I don't know if you'd use the word frothy, but I guess less frothy I can't even say that correctly, but in Europe versus the US. So I think maybe that's a part of it. But then I think there's a lot of different approaches. I think we try to cherry pick as a company with the best parts of different cultures, and I think there's I've spent over a decade living in the US. I think there's some amazing things that are inherent in how Americans approach things like business, and I think there's some amazing things to learn from it. Like there's an ambition and a drive that I think is a US characteristic, which not to denigrate anyone from Europe really, but like I think is something that is great and something that we try to embody on our side, as well as all the other things, right, in terms of kind of growth and making sure that we grow sustainably. So like again, I guess the conclusion is cherry picking the best bits, and I guess that's not the question you asked me, but I think like as a European company, I think you can try to take the best bits of all of those pieces, the drive that's inherent in the US, the ambition, but kind of combine that with, I guess, maybe some of the humility that you need in Europe.
I love that. And I know that the European market, I mean, there's a lot of vendors that are coming out of Europe currently and looking to get into the North American market, and then vice versa as well. And so I think the clash of the two markets and bringing the innovation from both sides, I think is really going to benefit the industry. And, we're going to be able to see what impact that's going to make, moving forward as we look to the future of supply chain. So let's change the focus on to freight forwarders, because that is who your ideal client is. That's who you service as Raft. So what do freight forwarders currently right now want from software? What are they looking for? I mean, I know most of my career was at a freight forwarding company. And so you can only imagine, like, I was on typewriters typing checks. I know it wasn't that far. But it's something that I was doing. I did a lot of stuff on the computer, but then there was a lot of things that I was doing manually. And I just remember sitting there thinking, I wish we had better software that we could automate parts of this, because I also, remember rekeying information and like data entry that really wasn't necessary if I look back and think back on my career in a freight forwarder.
Yeah, like, I mean, at the risk of talking our book, right? I mean, I think clearly automation and then ongoing efforts to automate are important. I think there is a new paradigm, and I know we're kind of going to talk about AI kind of later, but like, I think, we originally called our product Copilot when we originally started, and actually that's what Microsoft kind of have called all of their AI-enabled products today. And why am I saying that? I'm saying that because actually I think there is a future where every industry, not just freight forwarding, is thinking about how their staff can use the benefits of AI. And I think really that's like a training problem, really. I think it's a case where freight forwarders need to essentially make sure that their staff can upskill themselves to deploy things like automation and AI in their everyday tasks. And I think that's changing the kind of the paradigm a little bit, right? I think it's no longer just about kind of pure automation. It's like, how can my staff kind of best leverage themselves using the tools that are available? It's kind of like how you see on LinkedIn, right? You see all these kind of prompt engineering type of things, right? And how do you top 10 uses for ChatGPT somewhere in your everyday tasks? And I think that will have to percolate into every industry. And I think increasingly there's that kind of there will be that need to figure out how and this will be any company, not just freight forwarders, how any company can make their staff more efficient by harnessing things like automation and AI. And clearly in freight forwarding, as you know, it is a service industry. There is a heavy manual component to it across wherever you are. And clearly that is ripe for the kind of automation and innovation that comes with AI and technology. So that's a roundabout answer to your question. Otherwise, I think it's all the kind of standard stuff, right? I think freight forwarders increasingly in this kind of market where clearly revenue is dropping as rates drop. I think the cost base isn't getting any cheaper. We've got wage inflation on one hand. A more complex environment as well. If you think about all the different kind of complexities around where companies are increasingly sourcing from now, right? It's now no longer just China. It's all over. And so what does that mean as a freight forwarder? It means that suddenly your operational costs are also going up, because suddenly you can't just do the same old trade lane. You kind of have to do all of them. And so then complexity is increasing as well. So there's more bureaucracy as a result of that complexity. And so therefore your staff have a lot more to kind of manage. So it's an interesting time right now as a forwarder. So I would say kind of on one hand, it is kind of finding technology that can make and improve the kind of that complexity around the operational side and scale your teams more and do more with less. And on the other hand, it's also how do you get new business, or not just new business, how do you grow and retain business as well? And I think freight forwarders really what would help them with that is clearly better customer service in terms of like a digital front end. And you see this come up time and time again in surveys kind of over the last couple of years, is that kind of digital front end that freight forwarders need and want, right? And I think that's something that, if anything, I think a lot of the digital forwarders, the Flexports, the Fortos, the Zencargos of the world have excelled at, is at at least bringing that conversation up. right? They brought into the conversation the concept that actually you should have a customer-facing system that is robust and provides a more of a digital service to your end customer.
Right.
And I think increasingly freight forwarders kind of are continuing to realize that. I think people talk about visibility as a proxy for that, but it's not just about visibility in terms of container visibility. It's about all the other services. It's how do you deliver rates effectively? It's how do you show kind of the status of a process effectively, as well as kind of container milestones. And I think all of that wrapped up is essentially kind of how we think about the customer-facing piece and how freight forwarders can increasingly provide a better service and kind of move closer to their end customers, because ultimately that's what freight forwarders I think need to be, right?
Yeah.
It's not. I don't think it's a world where it's purely a transactional world anymore. It's not just about here's the quote and I'll speak to you in like a month, right? It's not a transactional business anymore. I think actually there's a lot of opportunity to add a lot more value to the end customer, the end shipper, again, with these digital tools and more. And then this comes full circle to the kind of some of the analysis that we talked about in that article, right? Once you have that data in a digital way, and it's kind of you've taken it out of all of these different silos and you presented it to your end shipper, then actually once you have that, then what can you do? Then you can start giving them reports and you can say, well, look, this trade lane's better than that one because of X and Y reasons. You might want to diversify because you know that in the future that port might happen, right? I'm all about, maybe some of this is my finance background talking, but like I think you should have this kind of efficient portfolio, right, of trade lanes, right? You know that if there's going to be disruption in one port, then you have to invest in relationships in other kind of areas. And I think I think all of these things kind of roll into the kind of data that can be provided to a shipper, so that a freight forwarder can continue to add value, and that comes through technology. So I'll pause there.
Yeah,
that's my piece.
And I think it enables communication and conversation in ways that we haven't been able to have those conversations as freight forwarder and shipper in the past.
Right, because they're keeping the plate spinning, right? Because you're
Yeah.
constantly keeping the plate spinning and doing the operational bureaucratic stuff. You can't be there to have that relationship, and ultimately, freight forwarding is about relationships, right? You need to abstract the rest away so that you can have those kind of relationships with your end customers, and that's what they want, and that's where the value comes.
Yeah, and being part of the strategy, being part of that strategic thinking of your customer and how they're thinking about their customers and how they want to see the partnership with you. What is the data that they need? What is the data that you're collecting? How can we use it in a positive, strategic manner to enable those conversations? So I love that. Let's talk a little bit about, before we get into AI, let's talk a little bit about cybersecurity. This is something that's been top of mind for me. I literally just did an episode of Thoughts and Coffee on Tuesday all about cybersecurity. Some of the examples were shipping lines and freight forwarding companies being attacked over the last couple of years. And so I don't want to dive into this too much, but it is a big risk, obviously, in supply chain for 2023. How high of a priority is cybersecurity in the minds of vendors and freight forwarders right now? Like, are we talking about this? Is this something, because technology is one thing and being and enabling them to be able to provide a new service. That's great. But every part of that conversation, every part of that supply chain needs to be secure so that we, can prevent those attacks. And so is that something that that's top of mind?
Yeah, it's clearly important. It's clearly something I think that every vendor has to have. And needs to be on top of in terms of their offering to their end customers. And it's something that we take incredibly seriously, and we spend a ridiculous amount of resource actually here dealing with. So it is, it's something that is incredibly important. I think will continue to be in the future.
Yeah. Well, and choosing the right vendor to make sure that, your supply chain and the technology and the people that you're working with is secure. Like, that's a really important part of the discussion, especially when you're talking about taking on a new vendor or working with Raft or things like that. So talk to me about the AI component. How important is this? How is this going to change the landscape for freight forwarders? What are you seeing in the future and the use cases of AI?
Yeah, I think clearly it's a hot topic. And I think there's a lot of companies that have kind of jumped on the bandwagon, right? And I think we see this in a pretty cyclical way. As I said, we've been thinking about this for 6 years. and something that is the core of our product. We've been delivering AI to kind of large companies and enterprises for a long, long time. So it's not something that's kind of completely easy to stand up. We don't love, or I don't love, like relatively superficial kind of applications of it, right? Like we're not going to release a chatbot or anything like that anytime soon. But I do think there's a hype cycle of the next kind of the next 6 months to a year, but I think there'll be a lot of people thinking about this. But I think over the next couple of years is where it will really kind of pan out, and we're kind of laying the foundations for the next couple of years as opposed to the next kind of couple of months. So I think there's a huge amount to do. One of the things that I find particularly interesting at a kind of a more general level, above and beyond like what we do, is like if you think about how AI and the kind of chat GPT world has changed, is that it's really it's moved everything from kind of like being, say, like the old school like website driven, right? It's like how best to kind of express this. It's more like it's changed the medium, the medium and the way people consume data.
Yeah.
So suddenly you've moved from, or what we've all moved from, kind of like Google search and kind of a website that get indexed and you access through via that medium, to something that is now taking that, making it hyper personal and putting it into like one window and giving you everything you need in one place. So it's kind of taken away all this other stuff and changed the medium that you access it. And I think that's a good proxy for how to think about AI in the future, is that it's going to change the medium by which people interact with data. And so I think the future is going to be something where kind of the old way of doing things, the old way of interacting with data in all different types of systems, and the way things have been for the last 10 to 15 years is going to get radically changed. And I think that's the exciting bit. So I think in terms of, we think about that in terms of our platform and how people work on our platform, we think that it's going to dramatically change. And I think it's going to change in ways that we can't anticipate today. But I think that's what I personally find interesting. And then suddenly, what that implies is that actually data is going to be really important, because you don't necessarily want to lose that traffic. Like if you're Google, if you have a website that's optimized for Google, then the data you have on your website that historically people have gone to your website for is now being consumed somewhere else. So then you're going to be a lot more siloed about the kind of data that you get. And I wonder how that translates into the enterprise world and that kind of increasing understanding that data within the silos in an enterprise is actually going to be increasingly important. And that's going to be it's increasingly be your moat. And I think that's a really interesting kind of phenomenon.
Well, and I think it also changes the way we look at data around our brands and how people are consuming or finding us on the internet as far as a brand like Raft or Let's Talk Supply Chain or JOC, right? How they're finding us in a variety of different ways. And it's enabling them to be able to do that because, like you said, they don't necessarily go to your website and read all about you on your website. They're finding you in different corners of the internet, hopefully good ones, with some good information. So where can people find you? Where can they connect with you? Where can they find you, James?
Yeah, exactly as ever written here. I think you can probably type in Raft.ai and it'll come to us. On Raft.ai, probably the only way, really. Or send me an email. I'm just
or LinkedIn. Are you on LinkedIn?
Yeah, we're on LinkedIn as well. I think I probably have a Twitter profile also. But
good. Well, if you have any questions for James, reach out, connect with him on LinkedIn, and send him a question. Send him any of your questions that you have, because I'm sure you would love to answer those. So 3 main takeaways from this particular conversation. James, what do you think people should walk away from this conversation with?
3. I think, as I said earlier, like the AI piece, I think it is about training and understanding that as a company, and this is clearly me kind of talking to our customers and potential customers, right? Like I think as a company, it's incumbent on you to scale your staff and make them and prepare them for a future where they can do their jobs better with the help of tools like AI. And for me, that's it's a bit of a paradigm shift of how people think about working with AI. Right? It's not a black box. It's not going to automate everything you do, but it's going to help you do your job better. And I think that is an important kind of takeaway point. Second, I don't know what the other two are, Sarah. Can you help me out?
Okay, that's a good one. The one takeaway. I shouldn't have said three. One takeaway. No, that's a really good one. All right. And just so everybody knows, throughout this conversation, we've put in the screen, put on the screen or the ticker, and also in the comments about Blended Pledge. Eric does a great job of talking about Blended Pledge. So go and check it out at blendedpledge.org. They've also got the IAPH conference coming up. We've got the registration link in the comments as well. And then Inland Distribution Conference, that's happening in September. And if you're going to be there, I'm going to be there too, but don't tell anybody. But go and register today because I want to catch up with you, meet you at Inland. And before we wrap up, Eric Johnson always does a dad joke. So I did my best to find a good dad joke that has something to do with our conversation today and technology. So the joke is, or however he presents it, because I don't know how he does. What does a baby computer call his father? Data. Man, I wish we could hear the audience because I'm sure some people are chuckling.
They're probably laughing, but also that doesn't work in English, in an English accent, you know that.
Anyways, happy Friday, everybody. I hope you enjoy the weekend. I hope you enjoyed this conversation on LogTech Live. Eric, I hope you're having a great vacation. And thanks so much for asking me to host today. James, thanks so much for coming on and talking to us about Raft and the market update and all the crazy things that are happening in LogTech today. So I appreciate that.
Pleasure to be here.